You've spent your career studying conflicts in Syria, Lebanon, Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka, Rwanda, Angola. It's a long list of global hotspots. And you found yourself on a CIA task force trying to predict why and when countries would experience violence. What did you learn?
So most people don't know about this task force, although you can Google it. It has a Wikipedia page. It's called the Political Instability Task Force. And what I learned when I joined them in 2017 was that one of the goals was to come up with a predictive model that would help the US government predict what countries around the world were likely to experience political instability and violence within the next 2 years. And when this model was created, and the task force has been around since 1994, the data analysts asked the experts who were on the task force, people who study civil war and violence around the world, they asked the experts to tell them every factor that could possibly matter. And it turns out that there's been hundreds of studies, many of them are quantitative studies that have analyzed large amounts of data on civil wars since 1946. And every time there was at least one factor that was statistically significant, the experts mentioned it. And so it was things like whether a country was poor or not, what its GDP per capita was, whether there were high levels of income inequality, whether there was a group that was heavily discriminated against, how ethnically and religiously diverse a country was. So the experts gave the data analysts 38 different factors, and the data analysts left for a while, and they began working with a model. And when they came back, they said that essentially only 2 factors mattered, and it wasn't the 2 factors that the experts had expected. The first factor was something called anocracy. Anocracy is just a fancy political science term for a partial democracy. It's a country that has elements of democracy, so elections are held and people go and vote, but it also has elements of autocracy. It could be that only one party ever competes in those elections, or it could be like in Hungary today, that the president, Viktor Orban, has such a hold on the media and is so effectively able to harass the opposition that he wins every single election no matter what. That's an anocracy. It's somewhere in between democracy and autocracy. The second factor that mattered was whether political parties in those partial democracies were mainly organized around race, religion, or ethnicity, and not around ideology. So these would be countries where instead of joining a political party because you were conservative or liberal or communist or capitalist, you joined a party because it was the party of Serbs or Croats or Muslims or Hutus or Tutsis. When a country had these 2 features, it was a partial democracy with these identity-based parties, that country was at high risk of political instability and political violence. And the task force put that country on something we called a watch list, and that watch list was sent to the White House. So we had actually a very good idea of the factors, the risk factors that needed to emerge before a country really went down this path.
And I'm guessing, when you look at the list of countries that tick off all these boxes, you're thinking of some of the usual suspects, Sri Lanka, Angola, Syria, Lebanon. We named some of them earlier. But obviously, since this was a CIA task force, they were not measuring America. And at what point were you looking at all of this checklist and going, wait a minute, where does America fall on that spectrum?
So I really started paying attention actually in 2016. And it was I'm the child of immigrants. My dad came over from Germany. He was born in 1932 in Germany, and he lived through World War II there. He was a lifelong Republican here in the United States. And starting in 2016, I would go home, and my dad was just in a panic. And he was not a guy who tended to panic. And all he wanted to talk about was what was happening in the United States. And I thought he was exaggerating the threat, but he kept saying, I saw this happening in the 30s. I lived through it. I never thought this would happen here in the United States. And I started to pay closer attention. When I got on the task force and I saw it was these two features, partial democracy and these identity-based parties. And if you remember, Germany in between World War I and World War II, that was a big attempt for Germany to democratize. The Weimar Republic was a pseudo-democracy. So I started to look at the data here in the United States. And as you mentioned, the CIA is not allowed to study the United States. It's not allowed to monitor US citizens. It is strictly an agency designed to monitor America's enemies on the outside. That's exactly the way it should be. But I, of course, was a private citizen, and I started to look at the data. And based on the data that the task force used, this is what I saw. The United States' democracy was downgraded for the first time in 2016. Prior to that, the way the task force, or the measure the task force used, went from a -10, the most authoritarian regimes, to a +10, the most democratic regimes. The United States had been a +10 for quite a long time. In 2016, it was downgraded. And it was downgraded to a +9. And that was because international election monitors who were here in 2016 deemed that election free but not entirely fair. And they deemed it not entirely fair because our own intelligence agencies had discovered that the Russians had in fact meddled in that election. So we were dinged in 2016. In 2019, again, by this measure, the United States was downgraded a second time. And this time it was downgraded to, I believe it was a +8. And the reason for that was different. In 2019, the United States had another sort of problem, or another event that revealed the weakness of our democracy. And that was an executive branch that was refusing to comply with subpoenas and requests for information from the legislative branch. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but it actually is. The main check on executive power, the main check on the president of the United States is Congress. And if the president basically thumbs his nose at requests for Congress for information that could actually correct any misbehaving in the White House, then that sort of indicates an executive branch that is running a bit amok. The United States was downgraded a third time at the end of 2020. And by December of 2020, the United States was classified at +5. +5 is in the anocracy zone. Anything that gets a rating of between -5 and +5 is an anocracy. And for the first time since 1800, the United States was classified as an anocracy. And the reason for that was, for the first time in America's history, we had a sitting president who was unwilling to accept the results of an election and was actively seeking to overturn those results. So we got dinged quite aggressively in December of 2020. Now, if you remember
Barbara,
what I said about the watch list.
Barbara, just to be clear here, who does the dinging? So who is the arbiter of what is a +5 and the +6?
Yeah. So this measure, the anocracy measure, is created and managed by a nonprofit that's based in Virginia called the Center for Systemic Peace. And one of the things that your listeners should understand is is the task force had no agenda. The task force didn't give preferential treatment to this particular measure versus another particular measure. And if you were to go online and look and Google something like data on democracies around the world, there are at least 5 major data sets, and those data sets have multiple different measures. So democracies are being measured by lots of different organizations in lots of different ways. And those measures were included in the model to see if any of those different types of measures would have an effect. And so one of the added surprises that the data analysts discovered was it was actually this particular measure, this -10 to +10, which really sort of laid out the institutional weaknesses of democracies that had the greatest effect.
So I want to remind viewers and listeners that all of this is a discussion about whether these markers show that a country, in this case the United States, can head towards political violence and then eventually a civil war. And Barbara, I want to push back a little bit on the idea that a country like America could have a civil war. So Ross Douthat, who's a columnist at the New York Times, he wrote a column saying that the fears of an American civil war are completely overblown. And I'm going to quote him here. He says, America's ideological divisions don't follow the kind of geographical or regional lines that lend themselves to secessionist movements or armed conflict. He goes on to say, America's political coalitions have become less polarized by race and ethnicity of late, not more. America's getting older and richer with each passing year, both of which strongly disincentivize transforming political differences into military ones. Above all, he says, a civil war needs people eager for the fight. He thinks that that isn't present. How do you respond to that?
Well, there is a lot in that, but my main response would be when people make that argument, they're often thinking about an 1860s version of a civil war. They're thinking about these big armies meeting each other on a battlefield where, you know, most of the civilians on one side have been mobilized, or most of the male civilians have been mobilized and are fighting, and many of them on the other side the same. And so it's this mobilization of society. And the reality is that is not how civil wars happen in the 21st century. And in fact, the United States' civil war was highly, highly unusual. Most civil wars look like insurgencies and guerrilla warfare, and they tend not to be fought by large armies. They tend to be fought by small militias or small paramilitary groups. And sometimes those groups are working together, and sometimes they're actually competing against each other. And the reality is they don't want to engage the government soldiers. They're trying to avoid battles and avoid direct fights with the government, because governments in most cases are much, much more powerful than these ragtag groups of insurgents or militias. And so what they do is they tend to take the violence to civilians. And what you see is a lot of terror. Terrorism is one of the main tools of 21st century civil wars. So the better example to think about is the IRA in Northern Ireland, right? Most Irish Catholics were not fighting in they call that the Troubles, but by the definition of civil war, that was a civil war. Most Irish Catholics were not fighting. This fight was being done by a minority of citizens on the ideological extreme, and they were not trying to engage the British army. They were going to lose if they did that. And so they were setting bombs in post offices, and they had snipers on rooftops picking off people that they thought were supporting the British government. And early on, they were picking off British police officers and Ulster police officers. And so that is what is more typical. And I think one of the reasons why skeptics have said this can't happen here again is because the model they're using is the first Civil War. And that's true. That is never going to happen again here. Something different, however, could easily happen here.
So let me spin this one more way. And again, the context here is I'm playing devil's advocate. I think it's really important to take all of the warnings that you have put out there very, very seriously. But one more thing gives me pause, and that is, and I say this as someone who, like you, as an immigrant, has moved to America. America's the richest country in the world. We think of the United States as a country with strong institutions, very high GDP per capita, unlike a lot of the places in other parts of the world that we typically think of as places that can tip into general violence and civil war. America's GDP per capita at about $70,000 a year is orders of magnitude higher than a Sri Lanka. So what gives there? Like, how would you go from that level of wealth and security to the kinds of scenes that we see in other parts of the world, but clearly are fearing here?
So for many, many years, people thought that a high GDP per capita would protect countries, that the most likely scenario under which civil war would break out is if you had deep, deep poverty. And we found that that's actually not the case. GDP per capita does come up statistically significant in some studies. But if you add a whole series of other measures that go along with wealth, so wealthy countries also tend to have really good governance. They have low levels of corruption. They have lower levels of income inequality. They just tend to be governed very well, and they have happy citizens. And it turns out that it wasn't wealth per se, but it was these measures of good governance. The United States is unusual in the camp of democracies. And it was unusual when it was at +10, and it certainly is even more unusual now that our democracy has been weakening, in that our political institutions, we have a whole series of very undemocratic political institutions. So America's democracy is certainly weaker than Denmark's or Switzerland or Canada's. And it's the weakness of our democracy, not the wealth, not the GDP of our country, that would put us at risk of political violence. Because when you have a weak democracy and you have increasing levels of corruption, people start to lose hope that the future is going to get better. They start to lose hope that even if they're poor today, that they might get rich in the future. If you start to have people who believe that their governments aren't working for them and are sort of paralyzed, then they come to believe that they're stuck in the situation that they don't want to be. And their only alternative is to turn to violence rather than work through the political system, because they no longer believe in the political system.
You wrote an essay about this recently in the New Yorker, and the title was "Democracy Needs a Loser." And, it strikes me that obviously the last election in this country did not have a gracious handover of power. How are you thinking about this next election and where that factors into the potential for violence?
Yeah. So, again, when I wrote the New Yorker article, I went back to the data, and this is a really, really rich field. There have been a lot of incredibly smart people who have been looking at elections and violence and trying to find patterns, and they found patterns. Post-election violence in democracies tend to happen under a pretty specific set of conditions. It tends to happen in winner-take-all democracies with strong presidents, where the population is divided, and that could be ethnically, religiously, or racially. and elections are contested. So at least one of the sides in that election believes that the elections weren't entirely free and fair. And so it's those types of countries that tend to be at higher risk of post-election violence. And of course, the United States has all of those characteristics. If you look at parliamentary democracies like Canada's or like Great Britain's, parliamentary democracies are much more immune from this type of violence, because if you lose the election, you are not essentially shut out of power. If your party gets X% of the votes, you get representation. That's not the case here in the United States.
It's interesting you say that, because there are countries that have had parliamentary elections this year. France, where you had a remarkable set of responses from the people. India, which kind of went against the grain of what everyone was expecting. Bangladesh, where we had violence recently, which kind of surprisingly led to the departure of Sheikh Hasina very quickly, in a way that surprised all of us. And what they all share in common, as you were saying, was, you know, a parliamentary system that was messy for sure, but it had some natural immunities.
Yes, exactly. And here in the United States, we know that the November election is going to be very close. You know, nobody has any idea how it's going to go today, and we probably won't know perhaps for days after the election. That means that whoever loses in November, that's going to be a substantial portion of the American population, the voting population, and they will have no representation whatsoever. And in a country where you also have the ideological polarization that we have today, where the policies that each of the parties is likely to implement is quite different from the other, this means that the side that loses will now have to live under a system that's pursuing policies radically different from the ones they want, and they will have no ability to do anything about it. That, again, is not the case in parliamentary democracies.
Yeah. So an important part of what you do and this discussion is to raise the alarm. And if there's any complacency about a place like the United States, to kind of stop that complacency.
Yeah.
But there's a second part of the subtitle of your book, which I really like, and that is how to stop them, how to stop civil wars when they start, if they start. And so how do you? I mean, obviously, you've studied all these countries around the world, but if there are a set of takeaways and antibodies that, aside from converting to parliamentary democracy style, what can countries and societies do?
Yeah. So again, I go back to what the data and the model tell us. And we know that healthy, mature, strong democracies do not experience civil war. If you're on the +10 side of this measure, your countries are peaceful. The violence is mostly in the middle. So what that tells us is the single best long-term solution is to reform and improve America's democracy. We all can point to these very undemocratic features that places like Switzerland and Australia and Sweden don't have. These other healthy democracies do not have gerrymandering to the degree that we have here. They don't have the Electoral College. They don't have big corporate money in elections. They don't have judges with lifetime appointments. America has these unfortunate features, and it's a result of the history of this country and the compromises that needed to be made to keep the Union together, in particular to keep the slave-holding states together in the Union. And we're stuck with it, and it's made our modern life much more difficult and much more vulnerable to democratic backsliding. So that would be the best long-term fix. The problem is it's really, really hard to do. And even when one of the parties, the Democrats, controlled all three branches of government between 2020 and 2022, and President Biden attempted to institute some basic democratic reforms, the Democratic Party itself did not have enough votes to pass those reforms. So there's a large portion of America that likes the system the way it is. And they like the system the way it is because it benefits them. So the groups that disproportionately benefit, for example, from the Electoral College or from the Senate don't want things to change, and they're going to work very hard to prevent that. So that's not an easy solution. Then the second factor, which is our identity-based parties. Boy, it would be great if both parties reached across racial, religious, and ethnic lines. It would be great if more African Americans and more Latinos and more Asians gravitated to the Republican side. And it would be great if more white Americans gravitated toward the Democratic side. If both parties started to move and go after the median voter, the moderate American voter, which can be any of those races and religions. That also isn't happening quickly, and so it's not a solution we can bank on, at least in the near term. So what do we do?
Where does ideology like? There's been a real scrambling, I think, of left and right, where it's unclear to me that some of the policies of the Republican Party, traditionally the right, that they actually adhere to true conservatism, just as sometimes the Democratic Party no longer truly adheres to traditional left policies. How much of that scrambling has to do with what you're getting at here, which is parties that are racially divided or divided along other lines? Is that because the left and right isn't as clear as it used to be?
I know the data show that the average American voter is more moderate than their representatives in Congress, for example. That the median voter is alive and well here in the United States. The problem is that the parties themselves and the elected members of those parties have increasingly come from the extreme. And one of the reasons extremism has sort of bleeded into Congress, for example, is gerrymandering. If you create these gerrymandered districts of almost all Democrats or almost all Republicans, and you do that to ensure that the Democrat in that district or the Republican in that district essentially has a guaranteed win. One of the unanticipated consequences of that is that suddenly they have to worry about a challenge from their flank, from a more extreme candidate within their district. And suddenly they have to shift to the ideological extreme in order to win the primaries in those districts, because primaries disproportionately turn out the more extreme voters because they're more passionate about the outcome, and therefore they're more likely to vote, especially in these types of elections. And so it's these undemocratic features that have created a situation where voters, even though they are more moderate, that the majority of voters in America are moderate. Elections are being determined by the more extreme members of their party. And so, that's one of the things we're seeing happening.
I'm curious about the role of social media here. And I mean this globally, not just in the United States, but it strikes me that part of the problem in societies the world over is a growing inability to agree on facts. And once you can't agree on facts and the truth, then coming back to what you said earlier, democracy needing a loser. If you can't agree on who's lost and who's won, you have a problem.
Yeah. So, to get back to solutions, because it's going to be so hard to actually make any meaningful reforms of our current system, and because it's going to take a long time for our parties to sort of begin to represent the full range of Americans, I think the single easiest and quickest solution to where we are today, to the fact that our democracy is weak, Americans increasingly don't trust it, and we have this increasing societal division around ethnicity and race, the single easiest and quickest solution is to regulate social media. The 5 biggest tech companies in the world are all American companies. The United States government has the ability to regulate social media the same way they regulate a whole series of things, from food to every other media company out there. Social media has gotten a free ride, and the result is that we're seeing a whole host of really negative societal outcomes come from this unregulated environment. When I say we should regulate social media, I do not mean that we should regulate content. Let people put whatever they want on social media. But what we should be regulating are the algorithms. And the algorithms are producing a scenario that is also injecting more extremism into our society and into our politics, because the algorithms are designed to do one thing: to keep people on their phones as long as possible. That's the business model. And it turns out that if you look at all the psychological studies about what captures people's attention the fastest and what holds their attention the longest, it is information that triggers very strong emotions of hate, of fear, of anger, and so that is disproportionately the information that is being pushed out to people. And once people like a particular video, or they like a particular article, the algorithm just feeds them more of that and more extreme versions of that, to the point where people on the right and people on the left are getting entirely different types of information, even if they ask the same question. And so there's no longer any commonality. There's no longer any common basis of knowledge in which they can understand with each other, that they can talk with each other, that they can come to some sort of consensus. So again, these algorithms, it's another way that extremism is being injected into our system in a backdoor way that most of us did not anticipate and are only now starting to see.
So let's hope this gets to the next president of the United States. But I want to take a few subscriber questions, and one of them is Cheryl Zerger, who asks, building on this, what else can an American president do to stave off a civil war without invoking authoritarian measures?
Oh, well, probably the single most important thing that governments can do, including our own, is that when you have isolated acts of violence, so let's say you have a mass shooting somewhere, or you have a series of bombs being placed in African American churches, let's say in the South, or in Michigan and Wisconsin, or you have another siege of territory like you had in Waco or Ruby Ridge. These events happen, and they will continue to happen, and they could escalate. When that happens, the single most important thing for the government to do is to react in a measured, controlled way. The fastest way to radicalize citizens and to get protests or riots to explode is to respond with disproportionate force. And, of course, here in America, the FBI learned a lot of lessons from Waco and from Ruby Ridge, and they began to importantly implement a policy called infinite patience, where you go and you just wait. You protect future targets, but you certainly don't go in with excessive force. You also certainly don't send in the military or soldiers. That's going to escalate things. And then you also don't take any measures to reduce people's rights and freedom. So, what one of the ways that wannabe dictators often grab power is during a crisis, which either emerges on its own or they manufacture. They call for martial law. They claim that this is a disaster, and for the sake of citizen security, they need to hold martial law. Be very wary of that. Our government understands how to deal with things like Waco and Ruby Ridge. We actually also understand how to deal with terrorism. September 11th in 2001 has given us a lot of practice and experience in deterring and preventing terrorist attacks. Our government has this information, and I'm certain that they're paying attention to what could happen after the election, and they're going to take all the measures they can to try to prevent it.
So I have a great question that just came in from another one of our subscribers. This is Ron Pagnuccio, and he asks, who are we worried about here in America? What are some of the organized groups in the US that you think might engage in post-election violence? And do you think many people not in organized groups might engage in political violence?
That is a really great question. So we know who some of the big groups are. And interestingly, they were all engaged in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And in the months leading up to that, for the very, very first time, they began to kind of form a pseudo alliance. They began to work together. Prior to that, those three big groups had operated independently of each other. And so you started to see them coming together with the same goal in mind. Now, one of the gifts of January 6th is that it was a wake-up call to America, and it was a wake-up call to the FBI, which prior to that had been focusing disproportionately on the threat of Islamist terror here in the United States, to the detriment of focusing more heavily on domestic terror, which by 2020 was a much, much bigger threat. January 6th changed all that. Suddenly, the FBI shifted gear and started to identify who the perpetrators of that attack was, started to prosecute them. And what we've had since then is a number of the leaders of those groups have been indicted and they've been imprisoned. And those groups have weakened as a result. That's good news, that the FBI is now watching and monitoring. They have a much better idea of the potential terrorist landscape here. What was the question again, Ravi?
The question was, who exactly are we worried about?
Oh,
the group.
So if you look more generally, the data, we have great data on domestic terrorism attacks here in the United States, and it goes back decades. If you look to the 60s and the 70s, the terrorism in the United States was predominantly left-wing terrorism. It was anarchists, it was radical environmentalists, it was people extremists who were pursuing far left goals. That started to change in the 2000s. Where if you look today, the vast majority of terrorist attacks are being perpetrated by far right groups. The left it almost disappeared, and there's been an uptick there, but it pales in comparison to the rise and the continued rise of attacks that are coming from the far right. If you look at what the far right means, most of those violent extremist groups are one of two types. They're either white supremacist groups, and they're the majority, they're about 70%. And The second largest groups are anti-federal government groups. So these are people who just like leave me alone. Keep your laws out of my state, out of my family, and those are the two big ones. Most of the attacks are coming, however, from white supremacist groups, and the data are really clear about that.
How do you go from all of this? I can see how violence starts, and a lot of our subscribers are writing in with this as well. How do you go from political violence to civil war? And does America not have enough of the institutional antibodies, the police and military infrastructure that could step in quickly enough? How much of that are you worried about being broken down in the next few months?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. So you go from political violence to civil war, usually with a disproportionately harsh government response. So if you look at Northern Ireland, the Irish Catholics were peacefully protesting for decades. In fact, they were modeling their peaceful protests after the US's civil rights movement. It looked very much like that. The IRA was operating, but they were viewed as fringe extremists by most Irish Catholics, and they did not have the support of most of the population. That changed after Bloody Sunday. When British troops came into neighborhoods in Northern Ireland and began clubbing women, clubbing innocent civilians, just being brutal in the face of peaceful protesters, that's when things began to explode. That's when your average citizen suddenly said, well, maybe what these extremists have been saying is right. Before I thought they were exaggerating, or before I thought they were out of their mind. But I now have hard evidence, which I've seen with my own two eyes, that what they're saying about the British is true, that they hate us, that they don't want us to succeed. They're going to repress us no matter what. And you see that time and time again. Syria would not have a civil war today if Assad had not responded to peaceful Sunni protests with brutal, violent repression. That's what radicalized the population. So here in the United States, you have violent extremist groups. Every country has them. And they're going to be really unhappy if their preferred candidate loses. And some of them will turn to violence. But they're not going to mobilize, and they're not going to gain the support of most Americans who are moderates and don't want violence. They're not going to get the support of those Americans unless the government goes in and reveals that in fact it is as terrible and as brutal as some of these extremists claim it is. So a really measured response is important.
各位充满求知欲的观众朋友们，大家好。今天我们要来探讨一个热门话题：2024年美国总统大选。这场选战可谓史无前例。究竟唐纳德·川普能否重返白宫，亦或是贺锦丽将突破性别藩篱，成为美国首位女总统？让我们直捣黄龙，一探究竟。这场选战利害关系重大，竞争激烈。从华府熙攘的街头，到华尔街的金融脉动，再到矽谷的科技巨头，全美各地都为之沸腾。首先，我们来谈谈川普。不论您是支持还是反对，都无法忽视他的存在。他的支持者一如既往的热情拥戴，他以让美国再次伟大的承诺激荡着选民基础。但且慢，贺锦丽可不是省油的灯。身为现任副总统，他一直处于政治漩涡的中心。他对美国的愿景是进步的、包容的、具有前瞻性的。他会是打破那道最高、最坚硬玻璃天花板的人吗？现在，让我们不要忘记那些不被看好的候选人。竞选过程中总会有惊喜，独立候选人、第三势力以及黑马都有可能以意想不到的方式扭转局势。这场竞赛鹿死谁手尚未可知，那么谁会赢得胜利呢？答案并不容易。民意调查、辩论和舆论每天都在变化。可以肯定的是，2024年大选注定将成为历史性的一刻。 请持续关注我们的报道，我们将为您带来每一次转折的最新消息。从竞选活动到投票所，我将为您带来第一线的最新报道。别忘了点赞、订阅，并开启通知铃铛，以获得更多突发新闻和深入分析。感谢您收看美国简报，下次见。请在 YouTube 上关注我们美国简报。